HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Capital, a novel, by Robert Menasse, translated from the German by Jamie Bullock, read by Gildart Jackson. Rêver, c'est le bonheur. Attendre, c'est la vie. Victor Hugo. Prologue. There's a pig on the loose. David de Vriend caught sight of it when he opened his sitting-room window for one last glance at the square before leaving this apartment for good. He wasn't a sentimental man. He had lived here for 60 years, looked out onto this square for 60 years, and was now bringing it to an end, that's all. It was his favourite phrase. Whenever he had something to say, report, attest, he would utter 2 or 3 sentences followed by, "That's all." For David de Vriend, this phrase was the only legitimate resume of each moment or chapter in his life. The removal firm had been, to fetch the few personal effects he was taking to his new home, effects. A strange word, but it had no effect on him. Then the men came to clear out everything else, including those things that were screwed and nailed down, and the screws and nails too. They yanked it out, dismantled it, and took it all away until the apartment was as clean as a whistle, as people say. De Vriend had made himself a coffee while his cooker and mocha pot were still there, watching the men, taking care not to get in their way, and he had held on to his empty cup for a long moment before dropping it into a rubbish bag. Then the men were gone, and the apartment was empty, as clean as a whistle. One last glance out of the window. There was nothing there he did not know, and now he had to move out because another time had come. But there it was. Down below was a real pig, in Sainte Catherine, the centre of Brussels. It must have come from Rue de la Braie. It trotted along the construction hoarding in front of the building. De Vriend leaned out of the window and saw the pig turn right at the corner into Rue de Vieux Marché au Grain, avoiding a few passers-by and almost running under a taxi. Kai-Uwe Frigge, thrown forwards by the emergency stop, fell back into the seat. He grimaced. Frigge was late. He was stressed. What was wrong now? He wasn't really late, but he liked to get to his appointments 10 minutes early, especially when it was raining, so he could tidy himself up a bit in the loo, his soaked hair, fogged-up glasses, before the person he was meeting arrived. "A pig! Did you see that, monsieur?" the taxi driver exclaimed. "It almost leaped into my car." He was bent right over his steering wheel. There! Can you see it?" Now Kai-Uwe Frigge did see it. He wiped the window with the back of his hand and caught the pig trotting off sideways, its wet body glistening a dirty pink in the glow of the street lamps. "Here we are, monsieur. I can't drive any closer. Fancy that. Almost went slap-bang into a pig. What a road hog. But I saved his bacon, didn't I, eh?" In Menasse, Fenia Xenapoulou sat at the first table by the large window with a view of the square. It annoyed her that she had got there so early. To be waiting in the restaurant when he arrived didn't convey self-confidence. She was nervous. She had worried that the rain might make the traffic worse and had left herself too much time. She was already on her second ouzo. The waiter buzzed around her like an irritating wasp. Fenia stared at the glass and told herself not to touch it. The waiter brought a carafe of fresh water. Then he came with a small dish of olives and said, "A pig!" "What?" Looking up, she saw that the waiter was staring out at the square, mesmerized, and now she could see it too. The pig was making a dash for the restaurant, a ridiculous sight as its short legs flitted back and forth beneath its solid round body. At first glance she thought it was a dog, one of those revolting creatures overfed by widows, but no, it really was a pig. It could have been straight out of a picture book. She saw the snout and the ears as lines, contours. That's how you would draw a pig for a child. But this one seemed to have sprung from a children's horror story. It wasn't a wild boar, it was a filthy, but unquestionably pink, domestic pig, with something mad, something menacing about it. The rain continued to pour down the window, and in a blur, Fenia Xenapoulou saw the pig screech to a halt as it encountered some passers-by. The creature's legs were at full stretch. It skidded, threw itself to one side, jackknifed, gained traction again, and galloped back, now in the direction of Hotel Atlas. At that moment, Ryszard Oświecki was leaving the hotel. He had already pulled the hood of his coat over his head on his way through the hotel lobby. Now he stepped out into the rain briskly, but not in too much of a hurry. He didn't want to attract attention. The rain was a boon. In the circumstances, both his hood and lively pace were perfectly normal and inconspicuous. Later, nobody would be able to say that they had seen a man running away, about this old, roughly this tall, and yes, of course, they remembered the colour of the coat. Turning smartly to his right, he heard animated cries, a scream, and a bizarre panting mixed with squeals. He gasped and looked back. Now he spotted the pig. He couldn't believe his eyes. There, between two of the wrought-iron poles that lined the hotel forecourt, was a pig. It stood, head lowered, like a bull about to launch an attack. There was something both preposterous and menacing about this creature. It was a total mystery. Where had the pig come from, and why was it there? Ryszard Oświecki got the impression that all life in this square, at least as far as he could see, had stiffened, frozen. The animal's tiny eyes reflected the neon light from the hotel's facade. Oświecki started to run. He ran to the right, glanced back. The pig yanked up its head with a snort, took a few steps backwards, turned around, then ran right across the square to the row of trees outside the Flemish cultural centre, De Markten. The passers-by, witnessing the scene, kept their eyes on the pig rather than the man in the hood, and now Martin Sussman saw the creature too. He lived in a building next to Hotel Atlas and was just opening the window to let in some fresh air. Sussman couldn't believe his eyes. That looked like a pig. He had just been contemplating his life, thinking about the coincidences that had led him, the son of Austrian farmers, to be living and working in Brussels. In his present mood everything seemed crazy and alien, but a pig on the loose in the square below, that was just too crazy. It must be his mind playing tricks on him, a projection of his memory. He scanned the square, but the pig had vanished. The creature sprinted across Rue Sainte-Catherine, keeping left to avoid the tourists coming out of the church, and raced on past to the Quai aux Briques. The tourists laughed, no doubt thinking that this stressed pig on the verge of collapse was a Brussels tradition, a local phenomenon. Some of them would later check their guidebooks for an explanation. Weren't bulls driven through the streets of Pamplona in Spain to mark some holiday? Maybe they did the same in Brussels, but with pigs. If you encounter the incomprehensible in a place where you don't expect to understand everything, then life can be very amusing indeed. At that moment, Ghouda Mustafa turned the corner and almost walked straight into the pig. Almost? Hadn't it in fact touched him, brushed his leg? A pig? Leaping aside in panic, Ghouda Mustafa lost his balance and fell. Now he was lying in a puddle, which made the whole thing even worse. It wasn't the grime of the gutter that made him feel defiled, but contact, if there had been contact, with the unclean animal. Then Mustafa saw a hand reaching down to him. He saw the face of an elderly gentleman, a sad, troubled, rain-sodden face. The old man seemed to be crying. It was Professor Alois Erhardt. Ghouda Mustafa couldn't understand what he was saying. All he grasped was the word, "Okay." "Okay," Mustafa said. Professor Erhardt kept talking, said in English that he'd had a fall today too, but he was so confused that he said fail instead of fall. Ghouda Mustafa didn't understand him and said okay again. The blue lights had arrived. Emergency services. Police. The entire square rotated, flickered, twitched in the blue light. The emergency vehicles sped howling towards Hotel Atlas. The sky above Brussels played its part. The rain fell. Now it appeared to be raining blue, twinkling drops. A strong gust of wind joined in, tugging at several umbrellas and wrenching them inside out. Ghouda Mustafa took Professor Erhardt's hand and allowed himself to be helped up. His father had warned him about Europe. Chapter 1. Connections need not really exist, but without them everything would fall apart. Who invented mustard? Not a great beginning for a novel. Having said that, there can be no good beginning, because whether good or not so good, there is no beginning. For every conceivable opening sentence is already an end, even if things continue afterwards. It sits at the end of thousands upon thousands of pages which were never written, the prehistory. When you embark on the reading of a novel, you ought to be able to leaf back after the very first sentence. Such was Martin Sussman's dream. It's what he had really wanted to be, a teller of prehistories. He had abandoned an archaeology degree, and only then— well, it doesn't matter. It's part of the prehistory that has to be edited out of the opening to every novel, because otherwise, in the end, we would never get to the beginning. Martin Sussman sat at his desk. He had pushed his laptop to one side, squeezing mustard from two different tubes onto a plate, a hot English mustard and a sweet German one, and wondering who had invented mustard. Who had hit upon the quirky idea of creating a paste that entirely masks the flavour of a dish without itself tasting good? And how was it possible that this had become a successful mass-produced item? It is, he thought, a product like Coca-Cola, a product that nobody would miss if it didn't exist. On the way home, Martin Sussman had stopped at the branch of Deleuze on Boulevard Ansbach to buy 2 bottles of wine, a bunch of yellow tulips, a bratwurst, and, of course, mustard, 2 tubes, because he couldn't decide between sweet and hot. The bratwurst was now bouncing and hissing in the pan, the gas was too high, the fat was burning, the sausage charring, but Martin wasn't paying any attention. He just sat there staring at the somewhat lighter yellow ring of mustard on the white plate, and beside it the dark brown one, miniature sculptures of dog shit. The specialist literature has yet to describe staring at mustard on a plate while a sausage burns in the frying pan as a clear and typical symptom of depression, but we may interpret it as such. The mustard on the plate, the open window, the curtain of rain, the musty air, the stench of carbonized meat, the sizzle of burst intestine and burning fat, the shit sculptures on the china plate. Then Martin Sussman heard the shot. He didn't even jump. It sounded like a champagne bottle being opened nearby, but there was no apartment on the other side of the curiously thin wall. Next door stood Hotel Atlas. What a euphemistic name for this slight building which chiefly housed hunched lobbyists pulling wheelie suitcases in their wake. Time and again, without thinking any more of it, Martin Sussman would hear things through the wall that he didn't especially wish to hear. Reality TV, or who knows, just reality, snoring or moaning. The rain grew heavier. Martin felt like leaving his apartment. He was well kitted out for Brussels. At his goodbye party in Vienna, people had given him pointed presents in preparation for Brussels, including 9 umbrellas from the classic British long and German telescopic models to the Italian Mini in 3 Benetton colours, plus 2 cycling ponchos. He sat motionless in front of his plate, staring at the mustard. Later, he was able to tell the police exactly when the shot had been fired, because what he imagined to be the popping of a champagne cork had encouraged him to open a bottle of wine himself. Every day he postponed the first glass for as long as possible. He never drank before 7. He checked the time. It was 19:35. Martin went to the fridge, took out the bottle, turned off the gas, tossed the sausage into the bin, put the frying pan in the sink, and turned on the tap. The hiss of water on the hot metal. "Stop gawking!" his mother would hiss whenever he sat there with a book, staring into space instead of feeding the pigs or helping muck out the shed. Dr. Martin Sussman sat there in front of the plate with mustard and poured himself a glass of wine, then another. The window was open. From time to time he got up and went to peer out of it, then sat down at the table again. On the 3rd glass, a blue light swept the walls of his room. The tulips in the vase on the fireplace pulsed a bluish colour. The telephone rang. He didn't pick up. Let it ring a few more times. From the display, Martin Sussman saw who the caller was. He didn't pick up. Prehistory. It's so significant, and yet it flickers unremarkably, like the eternal flame in the church of Sainte Catherine at the other end of Place Vieux Marché au Grain, where Martin Sussman lived. In the church a few people had taken shelter from the rain. They stood around indecisively or wandered down the nave. Tourists skimmed their guidebooks and followed the itinerary of sites. Black Madonna, 14th century. Portrait of Sainte Catherine. Typical Flemish pulpit, thought to be from Mechelen. Tombstones of Gilles Lombert Godecharles. The occasional camera flash. The man sitting alone in a pew appeared to be praying, elbows propped up, chin on his interlaced hands, rounded back. He wore a black jacket with a hood which was pulled over his head, and if Guinness hadn't been emblazoned on his back, he could have been mistaken at first glance for a monk in a cowl. The Brussels rain probably accounted for the jacket with the hood, but the impression he gave wearing it also betrayed something fundamental about this man. In his own way he was a monk. He regarded the monastic existence, or whatever he understood by this, asceticism, meditation, retreat, as the saving grace of a life under constant threat of chaos and distraction. For him this wasn't associated with any order or monastery, nor did it imply detachment from the world. Every man, irrespective of his job or function, must be a monk in his field, the servant of a higher power focused on his task. He loved to gaze at the tortured man on the cross and think of death. Each time he found it purified his feelings, concentrated his thoughts, and refreshed his energies. This was Mateusz Oświecki. His baptismal name, however, and the one in his passport, was Ryszard. Oświecki first became Mateusz in the seminary of the Lubransky Academy in Poznań, where every enlightened pupil was given one of the 11 apostles' names. He had been rebaptized and anointed as Matthew, the tax collector. Even though he had left the seminary, he kept Mateusz as his nom de guerre. Where he needed to show his passport at border crossings, he was Ryszard. From statements given by former contacts, he was known to intelligence services as Matek, a diminutive form of Mateusz. That's what his comrades in arms called him. He undertook his missions as Mateusz, was a wanted man as Matek, and slipped through the cracks as Ryszard. Oświecki didn't pray. He didn't formulate sentences in his head which began with Lord and were only ever requests. Give me strength to do this or that. Bless this or that. There was nothing to be wished for from an absolute spirit who remained silent. He gazed at the man nailed to the cross. The experience that this man had undergone and ultimately put into words for the sake of mankind was that of complete abandonment at the moment of confrontation with the Absolute, when the mortal coil is slashed, lacerated, gashed, pierced, and torn open, when the agonizing screams of a life fade to a whimper, and finally to silence. Only in silence is life close to the Almighty Spirit, who, on an inscrutable whim, has discharged from his self the very opposite of his being, time. Starting at the point of their birth, a person can think back, and back further, back into eternity, but they will never arrive at a beginning, and with their foolish concept of time will grasp only one thing: before they existed. For an eternity they did not exist. And they can think ahead, from the moment of their death to as far as they wish in the future, never reaching an end, but only this realization: they will be no more for all eternity. And the interlude between eternity and eternity is time, the clamour, the hubbub, the stamping of machines, the drone of engines, the crash and bang of weapons, the chorales of the furious and happily betrayed masses, the rumble of thunder and terrified panting in the microscopic terrarium of the earth. Mateusz Orzwiecki gazed at the tortured man. Rather than folding his hands, he had interlocked them, and now dug his fingernails into the backs of his hands until his knuckles cracked and the skin stung. He felt a pain older than himself, a pain he could urgently recall at any time. In early 1940, his grandfather, Richard, had gone underground to fight in the Polish resistance under General Stefan Rowiecki against the Germans. In April of that year he was betrayed, arrested, tortured, and then publicly shot in Lublin as a partisan. Mateusz's grandmother was 8 months pregnant at the time. Her child was born in Kielce in May 1940 and was given his father's name. To avoid the boy being punished by association, he was taken to the family of a great-uncle in Poznań, where he grew up and witnessed the uprising when he was 16. The young schoolboy joined Major Franczak's group to fight in the anti-communist resistance. He was used for acts of sabotage and later to abduct people working as informers for the SB, the Polish secret police. In 1964 he was betrayed by a comrade for 6,000 złotys. Richard was arrested in a safe house and tortured to death in an SB cellar. At the time, his wife, Maria, was pregnant. Their child was born in February 1965 in the village of Kozice Górne and christened with the same name as his grandfather and father. Another son who never knew his father, about whom his mother spoke little. Once she said, "We would meet in fields or in the woods. He would turn up to our rendezvous with a pistol and hand grenades." An eternally silent grandfather, an eternally silent father. The Poles, Martek concluded, had always fought for Europe's freedom. Everyone who joined the struggle had grown up in silence and then fought until they passed away into silence. His mother took him to see the priests, sought advocates, bought letters of recommendation. She put her faith in the protection that the Church could guarantee. In the end, she placed him with the brothers in Poznań, where he learned for himself the vulnerability of the human body. Blood is a lubricant to help get inside the mortal coil, skin merely damp parchment, the mouth and throat a black hole that is stuffed until the last sound fades to nothing, after which silently it sucks up what life ought to bestow. And there, too, he encountered an entirely new concept of underground. When the pupils were assigned their apostolic names, they were led into the magnificent cathedral of Poznania, into the secret underground vaults and sepulchres, via stone steps that shimmered and glinted in the flames of the torches, down into the deepest underground, through a final rough-cast tunnel, and into a chamber that turned out to be a sunken chapel of death and eternal life. A barrel-vaulted room, hewn in the 10th century from stone 100 feet below the blood-soaked earth of Poland. On the far side of this room was a monumental crucifix, with a terrifyingly naturalistic Christ figure, behind it reliefs of angels protruding from the stone, or seeming to pass into and through it, horrifyingly animated in the flicker of the flames. In front of the crucifix a Madonna, the like of which young Richard had never seen before, not in any church, nor in any picture in his books. She was completely covered up. The Madonna wore a cloak that she had arranged over her brow, nose, and mouth in such a way that only her eyes were visible through a narrow slit, eye sockets so deep and so dead as they could only be after 1,000 years of weeping. All of this, the altar too, had been sculpted and shaped from the stone and marl clay of the geological layer breached at this depth. Benches of cold stone on which sat 11 monks in black habits, their backs turned to Richard and the other pupils entering the room, and their bowed heads covered with cowls. The pupils were led forward along the aisle between the praying monks to the Christ figure, where they crossed themselves and were then instructed to turn around. Looking back, Richard could now see that beneath the cowls glistened skulls, while the rosaries in the monks' hands hung from bones. These monks were skeletons. Beneath the earth one is closer to God than on the mountain tops. Mateusz Orzwiecki tapped his forehead several times with the tips of his fingers. His own flesh felt heavy and rotten, and in his abdomen, beneath the navel and to the left, he sensed a burning. He realized that death was burning there, but rather than frighten him, it took the fear away. These skeletons in habits were the bones of the missionary Bishop Jordan and the members of the founding college of the Archdiocese of Poznan. For almost 1,000 years they had sat there in eternal, silent prayer. In the presence of these 11 skeletons, each pupil was assigned one of 11 apostle names. 11? No Judas? Yes, there was, but to give a pupil the name of Peter, God's primary vicar on earth, would have been insolent. He who is chosen can, as John or Paul, become Peter too. Mateusz Orzwiecki pressed his palms to his ears. So many voices inside his head. He closed his eyes. Too many images. This wasn't memory, it wasn't prehistory. This here was now, as he was sitting before the crucified Christ, with the burning in his stomach. He wasn't afraid, just felt that numbness you get before an important test or difficult task. The most difficult test is the one you can take only once. He opened his eyes, looked up, and stared at the wound in the Redeemer's side. Mateusz Orzwiecki actually envied his victims. They had it all behind them. He got up, stepped out of the stone of the church, cast a brief glance at the blue light dancing outside Hotel Atlas, and walked, head bowed and hood pulled down, slowly through the rain towards St. Catherine metro station. When Alois Erhardt returned to Hotel Atlas, he was initially barred from entering. or at least he interpreted the policeman's outstretched hand as an order to stay where he was. Unable to speak good French, he couldn't understand what the policeman was saying. When, from a distance, he'd glimpsed the rotating blue lights, his first thought had been suicide. As he approached the hotel, the feeling that had assailed him at lunchtime was back, as if...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?